Nick Offerman, an American actor, comedian and woodworker best known for his role as Ron Swanson in the television series Parks and Recreation, shares in his book Paddle Your Own Canoe crazy anecdotes from his life with humorous insights and provides practical advice on various topics including acting, work ethic and living a fulfilling life. Nick's advice about living life touches upon the fundamentals which may not work for everyone. His tactics involving the cultivation of lush facial hair and consumption of pork products might not resonate with most people, but perhaps the techniques in this book will at least inspire one to forge their own discipline, providing them with the necessary skills to blaze their own trail. For Nick, it's about finding those delicious flavorings in one's life and to inform, inspire and engender mirth. At the ripe young age of about 8, Nick was introduced to the world of literature in school, and one of the vocabulary words he learned was nonconformist, which he dug. He heard the explanation and the definition felt like he just learned about a new hero in a kick-ass Marvel comic book. Raising his hand to the teacher, he said nonconformist is what he'd like to be. He knew that he was peculiar and that he was a puzzle to those around him. He was also learning that this weirdness was a part of him and was not to be extinguished. He continued well into his teenage years with some tomfoolery than any human should ever have to countenance, playing in bands while indulging in propensity for high-grade jackassery. The key was in discerning just how much mischief he could get away with, focusing on making people laugh and firmly establishing himself as a miscreant purveyor of chuckles. Understandably, that led him to take onto the stage whenever he could. As his involvement in the arts expanded, he found himself being cast as more bad guys or anti-hero protagonists in school plays. He began to enjoy the therapeutic aspect of getting to play some version of an asshole. All of the weak human inclination that he had been raised to ignore were qualities in which he could revel on stage and could even win an audience's love through misbehaving. He was to also learn, according to Aristotle's observation, that theatre is a mirror held up to society. Taking on speech and creative writing classes in senior year, Nick would write odd bits of comedy for his speeches and would indulge in video camera work, preferring to film himself giving a video report instead of writing a paper. He was into making these weird random comedy videos which were 2 decades away from what YouTube is today. While proceeding to study acting in college, he made sure to learn another trade of carpentry and build things in which he earned more of his living with his tools and the labor of his hands during those long awkward periods while waiting for acting work to come by. His skills in carpentry provided Nick with food and rent both during college and for most of the decade that followed. He learned his craft and the use of his hands, not in a classroom but in the yard, in the garage, in the shed and even on construction sites. When someone tells us to make sure we have something to fall back on, we shouldn't take it lightly, Nick says. There are many modern schools of thought and action by which one can educate oneself to conduct some remunerative activity, often without the necessity of crippling college or acting school price tag. No one in Nick's or his family's sphere had ever attempted a career in the arts by any stretch of the imagination. Most of his friends and colleagues and family members enjoyed responsible lives by playing it safe, and at one point Nick was beginning to consider agricultural law as he liked farming, until he came across 2 students who suggested to him to work in live theatre in Chicago. This chance encounter and momentary chat with the 2 students would forge Nick's unwieldy steel and begin to test his mettle was possibly the biggest turning point in all of his tender years. Being accepted to the theatre faculty at the University of Illinois, Nick began his acting program and very quickly discovered he was just plain terrible at acting. He learned that unlike himself, his classmates had heard of Shakespeare and performed it, and he had some major catching up to do. As he trudged through years of theatre tutelage, he learned great many methods by which to stand and move and speak. Outside of classes, him and his acting colleagues would be mounting their own productions of Brecht and Pinter, and surprisingly even a rock and roll rendition of Shakespeare. By the time he graduated, the Defiant Theatre had been largely assembled with his class acting mates who were ready and eager to take on the city of Chicago. Nick hooked up with a colleague actor named Joe, and both were able to fully flex their creative muscles. They learned a key lesson that they would later exploit to great pleasure in Chicago. If one was responsible and hard-working when the job required it, then one was free to mess about as much as one wanted to when the work was over. As the director of the best Defiant plays, Joe was a great teacher to Nick. For years he had refused to give him the plum roles because Nick wasn't yet a good enough actor. Nick learned that he still had to exhibit the goods to get the job, and it only made him admire Joe all the more for the integrity and of his vision. He realized that they were being paid nothing or very little for the work on stage, and if they were not going to do this job as sublimely as possible, then why the hell were they doing it? Nick's take on making a play with friends is a gratifying feeling that one can certainly contribute in some small way to the spiritual health of a community. He believes that theatre actors are paid by the coin of an audience laughter and tears. Actors doing their part to keep humanity on the road to decency, and also to take a pie in the face so that everybody can enjoy a chuckle. His time working at Steppenwolf, one of the best theatre companies in the country, was incredibly educational. Although he ended up working there on 6 or 7 shows over a couple of years with some of the best artists in the country, he never had the chance to shine in a major role. Instead, he performed in more workmanlike ways, filling supporting roles, choreographing fights, making masks, and even once working as a makeup artist. If a person was willing to live on a slim income, that person could be rich in terms of satisfying theatre jobs. Only by leaving that time of financial poverty behind him did Nick realize just how wealthy he had been artistically. His first real paying job took place in LA for 2 weeks with Nickelodeon for a show called Kablam. He played a young hero's nemesis, Colonel Kudzu, for the 4 to 5 minute episodes. He then logged his first couple of legit film jobs, one of those playing with Morgan Freeman and Keanu Reeves in Chain Reaction. He got paid what was then 2 months of carpenter's wages for 2 days of acting work. Shortly afterwards he was cast in a Sundance movie called Going All the Way, starring with some youngsters at the time unknown such as Ben Affleck and Rachel Weisz. Upon deciding to move to LA and pursue an acting career with full intent as well as acting in minor roles, Nick also dabbled in carpentry work or art department projects as a PA, yet he was without a stage upon which to play his troth. He was hoping to do some theatre work as well, since it was just about all he could do. He failed to realise that LA effectively had no theatre community. He assumed that the largest concentration of acting and writing talent in the country would have a healthy theatre scene, but sadly that wasn't the case. Luckily, while he'd been in Chicago, a great casting director had gone batting for him and recommended Nick to several agencies in LA, where he landed at a small but very nice agency. They hooked him up with meetings and networks and studios, and he promptly repaid them by falling flat on his face. The executives in these meetings had no interest in nor ability to comprehend a theatre CV. Nick was naive to believe he could cakewalk into a successful career without eating some crap. At a certain point he realised that he wasn't cut out for the self-promotional part of this industry. He wasn't up for begging or pandering for roles or playing it cool while trying to convince executives that he can pull off a role, so he made up his mind to ignore the business. He decided instead to go back to his carpentry work, like building props and stuff for others, and thanks to his minor connections he started getting sporadic acting jobs here and there. Every few months he'd score a guest star job on a TV show or a little part in a movie, and these tidbits were just enough artistic food to sustain him. He began to describe his acting career as a very slowly rolling snowball. One of the pearls of wisdom the agents would tell actors was to videotape every show that's on TV, to be sure to watch every episode so that when one goes to audition for that show, they'll know what they want and what style they're looking for. Nick thought that was a dumb and stupid idea, that hundreds of guys would do what they think the producers wanted. Instead, he'd be that one guy doing something original, to simply be himself through the whole casting process. If he just presented himself as sincerely as possible, that was the best way to have a chance of getting hired. That was his technique, and he stood by it. He gradually learned that many initial rejections should eventually be taken as compliments. A lucky actor learns that the projects one says no to ends up being much more important than the jobs one takes. Every 2 or 3 months something really exciting would come his way, which would usually end in disappointment. The Tower of Steve was one of those disappointments, when the director of the film led Nick to believe that he got the part, but they ended up going with someone else instead. He was handed the lamest line as an excuse, saying he was more Gary Cooper and the other actor was more Montgomery Clift, which is more of what the story needed. Continuing on his journey, he managed to land a role on ER, which was back then considered the highest profile drama on TV. Since it was to be a live episode, they wanted theatrical actors who could hopefully avoid mistakes of having to do the scenes again. A year or two later, he was on the 5th episode of The West Wing. Even though he only had a little guest star part, he knew deep down inside he had worth and to stick around, since maybe next time he'll do 3 or 4 episodes instead of 1. One casting director told him that he was going to do great when he was to come into his sheriff years. If he grows a mustache, he'll be working like crazy. Luckily for Nick, the same casting director from The Tower of Steve was casting a film called Treasure Island, written more like a theatrical piece than a film, so they were again leaning towards some theatre actors. They ended up casting Nick and another actor as the leads of the movie. He suddenly had a lead role and Nick was over the moon. On the film, the producer and director valued him as an actor, but also as a dependable contributor. He consulted on acting scenes, drove the art truck, rigged lights, which did his self-worth a world of good. The film went to Sundance and got them a lot of nice attention. The snowball began to pick up speed, but still it was a good sight better than slowing down and melting. Nick's secret to getting cast? Don't give a shit about the audition. The secret to that? Being happy at home, being happy in love, being happy in the rest of one's life. When an actor is auditioning for a role, they are essentially presenting their own opinion of the character's attributes, the choices as rendered through the presentation of their own body and voice through performance. To some people who will almost certainly have differing opinions from their own, and that's before one can even begin to address the matter of their skill level and their ability to communicate their options effectively. An actor is working with an entirely different box of logic than the directors or casting directors are. As soon as one can flip the switch, as soon as an actor doesn't care as much, one's work becomes so much better because the actor appears so much more confident. People will think, hey, looks like he's just got something going on. It took Nick a while to learn that he didn't have to accept every job offer. A lot of early hopes were placed in the TV pilot basket, to roll the dice on a pilot and hope he might land on a Will and Grace or a Friends series. Until being in circles with a couple of comedy writers, one of them wrote a new pilot and created a character specific to Nick. He went through the audition process, which was kind of a cakewalk for once because it was written specifically for his particular sense of humor. Back then, Nick didn't have his mustache and therefore decided to grow one, believing it would suit his character. When reaching the final network test at CBS, sitting in a room with some other great actors for the same role, Nick thought he got this and that there's nobody here like him, and it was written purely for him. He did the audition, yet the head of CBS wasn't feeling the mustache and was looking for someone with a little more juice. Alas, he didn't get the part. Still, he was going out there getting these nice shots at success with some frequency, but he was consistently losing out to asshole corporate decision making. so he continued to plug away and was getting good movie parts in delicious Sundance movies. Gradually he was becoming slightly more known around town as a dependable character actor, and that went a long way towards supporting his artistic morale. He was able to maintain his confidence thanks to little signals here and there from the universe. Finding his stride, he would go into casting sessions with confidence, knowing that his weirdness was to the right people in the right way. He had cottoned that it was only going to be every 30th director or so who was going to get him, because the other 29 were looking for big bust or blonde hair or fast talking. He just had to find the people who were on the same page as him. He also learned what mannerisms turn off a room and then to try to subsequently avoid those behaviors. Insincerity would close down a room faster than a ripping fart, the discharge of which would also take some of the air out of one's credibility. The better things began to go for him, the better the auditions got, until he began occasionally to test for regular parts on TV pilots. A pilot test is the most exciting lottery ticket one can lay hands on, because a TV pilot would generally look at unknown talent more seriously than a film would. Therefore, an actor can suddenly find themselves with a legitimate shot at a show like Friends, Girls, Mad Men or Parks and Recreation, where Nick finally got his big break. Why is Nick's book title as it is? It serves as a metaphor for taking control of one's life and navigating through its challenges with independence, determination and a sense of humour.